introduction of deadly microbes to control or slow the growth of the Earth's population. AIDS is only one result of these plans.
It was said that the virus originated from green monkeys in Africa and was later passed on to the local population through either acts of bestiality or through consuming them as food. From there on, AIDS spread like wildfire across the African continent and later on to the rest of the world, claiming millions of lives. However, the story was just a smokescreen. On June the 2nd, 1988, the Los Angeles Times published an article refuting the idea that the human AIDS virus originated from green monkeys. It uncovered evidence that the DNA composition of AIDS was totally inconsistent with that of green monkeys. In fact, it could be proven that the AIDS virus could not be found anywhere in nature and could only have ever survived in the human biological system. If the virus did not exist anywhere in nature, the question is raised as to where exactly the virus all of a sudden stemmed from. On July the 4th, 1984, the New Delhi newspaper in India called The Patriot published an article making the first detailed charges of AIDS as being a counter-biological warfare agent. An anonymous American anthropologist was quoted claiming that AIDS was genetically engineered at the U.S. Army's Biological Warfare Laboratory at Fort Detrick near Frederick, Maryland. On October the 26th, 1986, the Sunday Express became the first Western newspaper to run a front-page story confirming the findings of the Indian and Soviet newspapers entitled AIDS Made in Lab Shop. The outbreak of AIDS has been linked to vaccine programs around the world. The internationally respected London Times newspaper published an article at the front-page story on May the 11th, 1987 entitled Smallpox Vaccine Triggered AIDS. The article establishes a direct correlation between the smallpox vaccine administered by the World Health Organization to an estimated 50 to 70 million people in different Central African countries and the subsequent outbreaks of AIDS in those regions. The World Health Organization is the medical wing of the United Nations. The evidence suggests that AIDS is a genetically engineered virus spread through vaccination programs in third world countries, germ warfare against the innocent and the weak, aimed at eliminating an entire populace off the face of the earth.
We are closely monitoring the emerging cases of swine flu in the United States. And this is obviously a cause for concern and requires a heightened state of alert.
The president now declaring the H1N1 outbreak a national emergency. The White House says the president signed this proclamation last night. It will allow medical officials to bypass certain federal requirements. Some officials describe this move as being similar to a declaration ahead of a hurricane.
And since the goal that I have read of the elite, if I can use that word, is to diminish our population on planet Earth by at least 2/3, maybe even 5 billion. So that's very, very negative.
We're facing this new disease which is coming out.
Swine? Oh, that's just rubbish. I mean, that is really rubbish. You know, it's not the swine flu that's dangerous, it's the injections. And of course, behind the whole thing is to diminish world population, because it's very toxic, and to get milliards and milliards and milliards into the pockets of those who put them out. Rumsfeld is an owner also in one of the big drug companies. And since they want to diminish the population, so they start saying that children and pregnant women are the first ones. Eliminate the next generation. They are just having a scary program in the mass media. All mass media says, oh, it's going to be terrible. Now it's something, blah, blah, blah. It's a scary, scary, scary propaganda. And people get scared because they don't know.
So what's the ultimate strategy you think that's happening with this? What's the target? What's the intent?
The target is to get rid of so many people as possible and to get as much money for them as possible.
Pour moi, l'enjeu là, c'est d'empêcher que cette campagne de vaccination se fasse. Parce que je n'ai pas envie que mon voisin, petit vieux, mal informé, et que tout ça dépasse, se fasse potentiellement empoisonner par ces vaccins, ni les enfants de ma voisine. Ce qui est en train de se jouer, je vais être cruel, je vais être violent. Non. Souvenez-vous, il y a 70 ans, les conducteurs de train de la SNCF, eux aussi, ils étaient réquisitionnés. Et ils ont conduit leur train.
De tous les pays de l'Europe nazie, des trains entiers ont vers la mort.
Et j'entends bien, mais 70 ans, c'est simple. Mais oui, c'est violent, vous avez prévenu. Mais réfléchissez bien à ça. C'est pas tellement à vous que je suis en train de m'adresser, vous savez très bien. Mais je m'adresse aussi à beaucoup d'élus qui n'ont pas conscience de ce qui est en train de se passer. Parce que ce qui est en train de se passer, c'est pas une simple opération vaccinale.
Ce nouveau vaccin anti-H1N1 a été créé en un temps record, du jamais vu dans toute l'histoire de la vaccination.
Je n'ai pas envie de jouer dans cette manipulation-là, et non seulement je n'ai pas envie de jouer, mais il est très clair que personne ici en France, nous agissons et nous allons continuer à agir, non pas pour voir ce qui se passe, mais pour empêcher.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
Anytime anyone criticizes Darwin's theory of evolution, evolutionists immediately cry, it's about religion.
Well, the claim that all skeptics about Darwinian orthodoxy or Christian fundamentalists stands refuted by me. It's obviously not true. I'm neither Christian nor a fundamentalist. But lots and lots of people are skeptical in the scientific community.
I became skeptical of Darwinian evolution early on, outside of any religious influence, just because of the complexity that I was learning about in the cell. And we use the word elegant in genetics.
The biggest impasse confronting evolution is the incredibly complex structure of the living cell. Every living thing on Earth is made up of 1/100 of a millimeter in size. Some living things are made up of a single cell. Yet even these single-cell organisms are remarkably complex in their composition. They have complicated functions to survive, and even little motors to move. In Darwin's time, this complex structure of the cell was unknown. With the primitive microscopes of those days, cells appeared to be little more than featureless stains.
In the 19th century, when Darwin was alive, scientists thought that the basis of life, the cell, was some simple blob of protoplasm. That's exactly what Darwinism is doing. That's about living cell, which is everything from cells,
However, powerful electron microscopes invented around the middle of the 20th century began revealing just how complex and organized it was.
With the hard work of science in the 20th century, we've seen that the cell is far from simple. It's got very complicated molecular machines and things that are very resistant to Darwinian explanation.
out from across the cell, opening doors, closing doors, motor molecules. Actually, motor molecules moving along tracks. It is probably one of the most dynamic physical systems in the universe.
Not even the most sophisticated laboratory has been able to produce a single living cell from non-living matter. Indeed, this is fully acknowledged to be impossible, and efforts to produce living cells from non-living matter have been abandoned. But the theory of evolution claims that this system, which man with all his intelligence, knowledge, and technology cannot succeed in reproducing, came into existence by chance.
Fred Hoyle, a famous English mathematician, expressed the impossibility of formation of higher life forms without a creator. The chance that higher life forms might have emerged by chance is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from materials therein.
The ingredients must combine. But they must combine according to an exact formula, in a unique way. The living molecules in your body that have protein, enzymes, DNA programming in them, the very simplest is made up of many hundreds of components. So 100 components would have one chance in 100 million billion chance of being correct. But you see, the 100 components actually also have 4 chemical elements in each one. and really the simplest living cell that can replicate itself has 400 components. So now we've got 4 times 400, which is 1600. So we've got 1600 components, and that would be, well, 1 in 167,636 zeros following. That would be the odds against such a right combination. And wait a minute. Oh, you say, but that's a very rare thing, those kind of cells with those components. Do you know what, my dear brother and sister? You have a brain with 10 billion components. Components. There would only be one chance in 39,916,800 that they could combine correctly.
Modern biochemistry has also revealed the unimaginably complex design of the DNA molecule. The structure of the DNA The structure of the DNA molecule was discovered by 2 scientists, James Watson and Francis Crick, in 1955. Their discovery demonstrated that life was much more complex than anyone had previously envisioned. Himself a confirmed evolutionist, Francis Crick, who received a Nobel Prize for this discovery, came to confess that a structure like DNA could never have emerged by chance.
Think of a cell as being a nano factory, a factory where, on a very small scale, digital instructions are being used to make the components of the factory. Here we have the famous DNA double helix. You can see the 2 helical strands that are intertwined and wind around each other on the outside of the molecule. This is the material that stores all of our genetic information. In higher life forms, this will be the equivalent of something like a gigabyte of information stored in the molecules that form the individual chromosomes all packed within the nucleus, which is a tiny fraction of the entire cell size. So what does DNA do? Well, the information in DNA ends up providing the information for sequencing the amino acids to make protein. We have information in a one-dimensional form that provides the information for a three-dimensional form.
If we attempt to write down the information in the DNA, this would take up approximately 1 million pages. This is equal to an encyclopedia 40 times bigger than the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is one of mankind's greatest single accumulations of information. But this incredible information is stored in the tiny nucleus of our cells, measuring about 1,000th of a millimeter in size. It is calculated that a DNA chain small enough to fill a teaspoon has the capacity to store all the information contained in all the books ever written. Of course, such an amazing structure could never have been. The theory of evolution, which sees life as the result of mere coincidences and haphazard happenings, is helpless to explain anything in the face of the incredible complexity of DNA.
The information that is stored in the DNA molecule is pointing back to a designing intelligence. Now, why do I say that? It has to do with what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world. Our local hero in Seattle, Bill Gates, says the DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever created. And that's a very suggestive remark because we know that programs always come from programmers. And in fact, we know generally that information, whether it's in a computer program or a hieroglyphic inscription or in a headline in a newspaper or a block of text in a book, information always comes from an intelligent source. So when we find information in the DNA molecule, the most logical thing to conclude is that it too had an intelligent source.
Now, Dr. Werner Gitt is an information specialist. Since we're talking about information, we'll go to an information specialist. He wrote a book called In the Beginning Was Information that you and I both love. And in his book he says this: a code system is always the result of a mental process. It requires an intelligent origin or inventor. It should be emphasized that matter as such is unable to generate any code. All experiences indicate that a thinking being voluntarily exercising his own free will, cognition, and creativity is required. He goes on to say, there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. And do you realize what a serious problem that is for the evolutionists? It's a tremendously serious problem. Here's an information specialist saying that information never comes from naturalistic processes. It always requires intelligence.
A living cell is comprised of thousands of tiny parts that work in harmony. To make a comparison, within the cell, there are power stations, high-tech factories, a complex data bank, huge storage systems, advanced refineries, and a seemingly conscious cell membrane that controls what enters and leaves the cell. In order for the cell to survive, all of these organelles have to exist at the same time.
Irreducible complexity was coined by Mike Behe in describing these molecular machines. Basically what it says is that you have multi-component parts to any given organelle or system in a cell, all of which are necessary for function. That is, if you remove one part, you lose function of that system.
Without the tools to observe the machinery in the cell, and long before the idea of irreducible what Michael Behe and others have discovered is the existence of biological machinery that cannot be explained away by Darwinian processes. Darwin's failed predictions have in fact falsified his own theory. Falsified his own theory.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Darwin proposed that all species evolved successively from a common ancestor. But how did that first living thing come into being? Darwin did not address this question at all in his book. He was not even aware that this point was one of the biggest refutations of his theory. The primitive understanding of science in his day assumed that life had a very simple structure. According to a theory called spontaneous generation, which was popular since the medieval age, it was believed that living things could easily arise from non-living matter. It was commonly thought that frogs spontaneously arose from mud and bugs from food leftovers.
In medieval times, for instance, the scientific world was convinced that vermin and flies were generated directly from rubbish dumps or garbage. In fact, the belief was so strong that in 1668, the celebrated Italian scientist Francesco Redi had to demonstrate by means of a simple experiment that vermin and flies breed in garbage. They don't come from it.
And in Darwin's time, the belief that microbes could emanate easily from non-living materials was very common. But 5 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, the famous French biologist Louis Pasteur scientifically refuted these myths that lay ground for evolution.
After lengthy studies and several experiments, the famous French biologist Louis Pasteur refuted the foundation that lays ground for the theory of evolution.
Can matter organize itself? No. Today there is no circumstance known under which one could affirm that microscopic beings have come into the world without parents resembling themselves.
The first evolutionist to take up the issue of the origin of life in the 20th century was the Russian biologist Alexander Oparin. His aim was to explain how the first living cell, the alleged common ancestor of all living beings according to the theory of evolution, could emerge. In the 1930s, Oparin formulated a number of theories to show how the first living cell could arise from inanimate matter by chance. However, his efforts ended in failure, and Oparin himself had to confess. Unfortunately, the origin of the cell remains a question that is actually the murkiest aspect of the whole theory of evolution. Evolutionists that followed Oparin conducted experiments to find an evolutionist explanation. The most famous of these experiments was conducted by the American chemist Stanley Miller in 1953. Miller obtained a few simple organic molecules by triggering a reaction among gases that he claimed would have been present in the primitive Earth atmosphere. At the time, this experiment was regarded as a scientific proof for evolution. It turned out to be no such thing at all.
A few years ago, Stanley Miller did a famous experiment. He took some simple materials, some methane, some ammonia, some water vapor, zotzed them with an electric spark to simulate lightning flashing back and forth in the atmosphere of the ancient Earth, and in just a week, he got amino acids, the building blocks of protein. And that was hailed as almost making life in a test tube. And that was one I used when I used to teach evolution. But I took a look at the rest of the evidence. And there are 3 problems with that brilliant experiment. 1, he had the wrong starting materials. 2, he used the wrong conditions. And 3, he got the wrong results. Other than that, it was a brilliant experiment.
The Miller experiment assumed an atmosphere of methane and ammonia, gases that could not have been present in large amounts because the ammonia would be decomposed by ultraviolet light, and methane should be found stuck to ancient sedimentary clays, but is not. Miller also left out oxygen because he knew that oxygen would destroy the very molecules he was trying to produce. But as deep as we dig, we find rocks, suggesting an oxygen-rich atmosphere.
The Earth did not have a reducing atmosphere, say an atmosphere of methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. That was suggested in the Stanley Miller experiment. The Earth never had such an atmosphere. The geology is now clear. There is good evidence that the Earth has always had oxygen in its atmosphere. Now that would absolutely preclude any evolutionary origin of life.
Miller also used the wrong conditions. He used an electric spark to combine the gas molecules. The problem is that the same spark that puts amino acids together also tears them apart, and it's much better at destroying them than making them.
The problem was the chemicals put together, the amino acids in the flask, would also be torn apart by the very spark that put them together. Miller knew that as a biochemist, and so he circulated the gases, trapped out the molecules he wanted, using a well-known biochemist trick, but that would be cheating, because you were supposed to say this is how life arose before there was any intelligent design to preserve these molecules from that destructive force. Wrong conditions. Then he got the wrong results.
The main product of the Miller experiment was tar, a nuisance in organic reactions. Trace amounts of several amino acids that make up the proteins in living things were also produced. The problem is that Miller's experiment produced both left-handed and right-handed amino acids. Only left-handed amino acids make up the proteins of life, and just one right-handed molecule prevents their production. What Miller actually produced was a poisonous brew that would destroy any hope for the chemical evolution of life.
You might say, well, if what I've just said is true, what about all the evolutionists that believe in this? Well, interestingly enough, the evolutionists would agree with me. There was a time I was at a debate at San Diego State University. I was just in the audience, but 2 friends of mine, Dr. Henry Morris and Dr. Dwayne Gish, were doing the debate for the creation. At the end, someone in the audience noted, ladies and gentlemen, we're privileged this evening. We have in our audience Dr. Stanley Miller. And Gish had explained why Miller's experiment would not produce life from non-life. And so the person asked Dr. Miller, would you like to respond to what Dr. Gish said about your experiments for chemical evolution? And Dr. Miller said, no. He hasn't believed in that for decades.
Miller himself eventually admitted to the invalidity of his experiment. Every evolutionist attempt in the 20th century to account for the origin of life has ended in failure.
Jeffrey Bada, a professor of geochemistry and a leading advocate of the theory of evolution, confesses this in the February 1998 issue of Earth, one of the leading periodicals of evolutionist literature.
Today, as we leave the 20th century, we still face the biggest problem that we had when we entered the 20th century. How did life originate on Earth? How did life originate on Earth? How did life originate on Earth?
وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وأعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Darwin proposed a single concept as his evolutionary mechanism: natural selection. The title of his book clearly reveals the importance he gave in this mechanism: the origin of species by means of natural selection.
Natural selection was a powerful idea. Physical variations that proved advantageous would be inherited by succeeding generations. Through this process, populations would be altered, and over time, fundamentally different organisms would arise without any form of intelligent guidance.
About the emergence of favorable traits, Darwin was deeply influenced by one of his contemporaries, the French biologist Lamarck.
The French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was the first person to give a detailed account of the theory of evolution. Lamarck's theory, which was later refuted, maintained that living beings evolved from one another variations over time.
Lamarck thought that living things passed their acquired traits to future generations.
This was a form of another mistaken belief called acquired inheritance. It holds that any changes a plant or animal undergoes in response to its environment are passed on to its offspring.
In Lamarck's view, giraffes evolved from deer-like creatures. Their necks extended from generation to generation as they tried to reach higher branches for food. Lamarck also believed that if the arms of the members of a family were cut off for generations, the babies would start to be born armless after a while. Darwin, who was quite influenced by these examples, came up with an even bolder claim. In The Origin of Species, he argued that some bears, while trying to hunt in water, evolved into whales. But both Lamarck and Darwin were wrong. The laws of inheritance, discovered by an Austrian botanist, Gregor Mendel, caused Lamarck's and Darwin's assertions to collapse.
It is not surprising that Darwin got heredity wrong. So did everyone else who tried to find an underlying pattern in a surface picture that seems so random and disorderly. But unbeknownst to Darwin or anyone else, someone was busy solving this great puzzle. In the process, he laid the groundwork for the new science of genetics.
In 1866, his research was published in a scientific journal and then sent to more than 120 libraries and universities. Mendel's discovery correctly described biological reality, and yet it carried a conspicuous flaw. It did not confirm the atheist spirit of the times. For example, Ernst Haeckel completely dismissed Mendel's work, and he endeavored instead to substantiate the theory of evolution and elevated the false ideas about heredity based on the ideas of Lamarck to the status of a law. Today, false beliefs about the inheritance of acquired characters are attributed solely to Haeckel, but Darwin too was wrong.
The science of genetics that developed at the beginning of the 20th that it was not acquired physical traits, but only genes that were transmitted to subsequent generations. This discovery made it clear that a scenario suggesting that acquired traits accumulated from generation to generation and generated different living species was implausible. In other words, there were no inheritable variations for Darwin's proposed mechanism of natural selection to choose from. Subsequently, the theory of evolution as advanced by Darwin has been collapsed early in the 20th century. All the other efforts by evolutionists in the 20th century could do nothing but only confirm that natural selection had no evolutionary power.
Genetic pioneers like Carl Correns and Niels Heribert Nielsen repeatedly emphasized that selection alone doesn't create something new. It only acts as a filter, like a sieve. Just as a sieve doesn't create new tea leaves, selection doesn't create new forms of life or new species.
Natural selection is a real process, and it works well for explaining certain limited kinds of variation, small-scale change. We have lots of examples of that, in fact. Where it doesn't work well is explaining what Darwin thought it could, namely the real complexity of life. We have the finch beak, and then you've got the finch itself. A minor change in the structure of the beak versus the origin itself. These are different scales of phenomena. These are different kinds of problems. And the important problem for biology is to understand where natural selection works and where it doesn't, and why there's a difference.
Evolutionist Roger Lewin has a much more credible take on this subject. Natural selection, as the central characteristic of neo-Darwinism, can have a stabilizing effect, but does not provide the creation of new species. It is not the creative force that many have suggested.
A famous evolutionist, the English paleontologist Colin Patterson, admitted this when he said, "No one has ever produced a species by mechanisms of natural selection. No one has ever got near it, and most of the current argument in neo-Darwinism is about this question." When it was clear that the mechanism of natural selection proposed by Darwin had no evolutionary power, evolutionists had to make a fundamental change in the theory. In addition to the concept of natural selection, they added a second mechanism called mutation. Mutations are alterations or distortions that take place in the DNA of living beings, mostly as a result of external effects such as radiation or chemical action. The only dissimilarities are a few structural differences in their skulls. But differences like these are to be found in different human races alive on Earth today. The famous evolutionist paleontologist Richard Leakey admits that the difference between the skulls classified as Homo erectus and those of modern men is only racial. These differences are probably no more pronounced than we see today between the separate geographical races of modern humans.
The most important missing link of all, of course, is the missing link between an ape-like ancestor and mankind. That's the missing link that most of us are interested in. Have we found that? Well, if you listen to Darwinists, you'd think that we found lots of them. In fact, the evidence really isn't there at all. All of the fossils that have been found so far have been classified, reclassified, either as human or as ape.
If we analyze the so-called missing links, we find a trail of fraud, deception, and speculation. For example, Nebraska man was reconstructed, family and all, from an extinct pig's tooth. Piltdown man is now universally known to be a deliberate hoax, consisting of an ape's jaw and a human skull, doctored to look old.
Piltdown, a quaint village in England, was hailed as the missing link between apes and humans. It was named Piltdown Man. Later, it would be called a forgery and set off a storm of scandal.
The scientific world was in an uproar. The public was scandalized. Were monkeys being made out of the scientists?
Neanderthals were just plain people, some of which suffered from arthritis, rickets, or syphilis. Ramapithecus, Gigantopithecus, and Zyganthropus were just apes, while Heidelberg man and Cro-Magnon were completely. So, despite evolutionists' misleading claims, the missing link is still missing.
Her name is Ida. She's 47 million years old, and you're looking at one of our ancestors. She is, according to scientists, a direct relative. Ida and her descendants evolved into humans. Since Darwin, mankind has been looking for the missing link. the primate that's at the root of our creation. And this is she.
Now people can say, okay, you say we're primates, like monkeys and apes, and that we came from very simple, generalized mammals. Show us the link. The link, they would have said, until now, is missing. Well, it is no longer missing.
There is a lot of excitement tonight in the world of science over a find that scientists are saying walked the Earth more than 4 million years ago. Our chief science correspondent, Robert Bazell, has more on the female creature called Ardi, who may be our oldest known relative.
Dave Phillips is professor of paleontology at the Master's College. He discusses that among the bones that have been found, there is a great lack of articulated or complete skeletons.
These remains are almost always highly fragmentary. We don't find nice, neat, articulated skeletons. You find little teeny fragments remains, perhaps a part of a jaw or mandible. Or you might find a piece of a limb bone, or you might find a few fragmentary bones from one individual skull. When it comes to the alleged sequence of human remains said to demonstrate evolution, we find this completely wanting. We do not find the intermediate forms necessary to document that.
The only evidence at hand is generally nothing more than a few skull fragments or a tibia. The hair, skin, nose, ears, lips, or other facial features of a living being cannot be determined from its bone remains. Evolution has shaped these soft tissues, which leave no trace in the fossil, to suit the purposes of their theory, and produce imaginary reconstructions in their workshops. Ernest Houghton from Harvard University states that these drawings have no scientific value. You can, with equal facility, model on a Neanderthaloid skull the features of a chimpanzee or the lineaments of a philosopher. These alleged restorations of ancient types of man have very little, if any, scientific value, and are likely only to mislead the public.
Darwin wrote, "Intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reflect finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory."
Darwin was aware that the fossil record did not contain any of these hypothetical intermediate forms. This is why he devoted a special chapter to this in his book and posed these troubled questions. Why, if species have descended from other species by fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? But as by this theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the Earth? For instance, a 400-million-year-old shark and a modern shark have exactly the same structure. Similarly, there is no difference between a 100-million-year-old ant and a modern ant, a 135-million-year-old dragonfly and a modern dragonfly, a 100-million-year-old turtle and a modern turtle, or a 55-million-year-old bat and a modern bat.
According to most biology textbooks, fossils show the gradual development of life from simple to complex over hundreds of millions of years. But a growing number of scientists say that this textbook story is incomplete and even misleading because it ignores an extraordinary event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
According to most biology textbooks, fossils show the gradual development of life from simple to complex over hundreds of millions of years. But a growing number of scientists say that this textbook story is incomplete and even misleading because it ignores an extraordinary event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion.
The Cambrian explosion is a term that refers to the geologically sudden appearance of all the major, or most of the major groups of animals at about the same time, geologically speaking.
Most geologists date the Cambrian explosion at 530 to 520 million years ago.
The Cambrian explosion is a name given to a geologic event, really, the appearance in the fossil record over a period of about 10 million years or slightly less of skeletonized fauna that includes many living phyla for the first time.
In Darwin's theory, if you think of the branching tree, Darwin's branching tree, the common ancestor down here and the different modern forms of animals up here, you would have one form to begin with, and then it would gradually diverge into slightly different forms and more different until you get the major differences that we see now. The problem with the Cambrian explosion is that all these major differences appear together at the same time, with no fossil evidence that they descended from this common ancestor.
One of the world's leading researchers of the Cambrian explosion is J.Y. Chen, a paleontologist at the Nanjing Institute of Paleontology and Geology. Chen's discoveries in the fossil beds in Shenzhen, China, have rocked the scientific establishment. According to Chen, the fossils he's found turn upside down Darwin's tree of life.
Darwin's tree reverse construct very unexpectedly. Our research is convincing major phyla starting down below at beginning of Cambrian. Base is wide, gradually narrow, so this is almost turned down differently.
One of the greatest evidences for creation is found in the fossil record. For example, in the so-called Cambrian rocks, we find fossils of a vast array of very complex invertebrates: clams, snails, jellyfish, worms, brachiopods, trilobites, and many other very complex invertebrates. But nowhere on the face of this earth has anyone found fossilized ancestor to a single one of those complex invertebrates. Now that fact alone demolishes the theory of evolution.
We have no fossil evidence of the ancestors of most of the modern groups of animals. One clear exception is sponges. We do have fossil sponges from before the Cambrian explosion. But in a short space of maximum, as I understand it, 5 or 10 million years, which is a blink of an eye, geologically speaking, 30 some odd major groups of animals appear recognizable and altogether suddenly on the scene. This is completely contrary to Darwin's theory. This is completely contrary to Darwin's theory. This is completely contrary to Darwin's theory.
Because Darwin wrote in The Origin of Species, if numerous species belonging to the same genera or families have really started into life all at once, the fact would be fatal to the theory of descent with slow modification through natural selection.